Hey everyone, just letting you know that this video does contain spoilers for the second act of Wicked, the stage production. So if you're somebody who's unfamiliar with the show and wants to go into the second movie completely unspoiled, I would advise you not to watch any further. So right now, it seems that Wicked fever is sweeping the world. Reviews have, for the most part, been extremely enthusiastic, it's doing big numbers at the box office, its marketing campaign has ensured that you can't turn a corner without encountering a reminder of its existence, and it's almost certainly going to be one of the titles in play during this year's award season. While it would be an exaggeration to say the film's overall reception has been entirely without criticism, it certainly does seem that most people are responding to it in a really positive way. But, as I'm sure you could guess from the title and thumbnail of this video, I'm not one of those people. And I'm pretty bummed about that. Obviously, it always sucks to feel like you're in the minority on a popular work of art, but it's even worse when the work of art in question feels like it theoretically should appeal to you. I say this because I'm actually a big fan of Wicked the stage musical. I've only seen it performed once, but I'm quite intimately familiar with the soundtrack, and I've always really enjoyed the twists it puts on a story we're all so familiar with. I can't say that I went into this movie completely primed to love it. I was already nervous about quite a few things, which we'll get into a little bit later. But the positive critical reception did have me going in with more of a sense of optimism than I had previously had about it. And unfortunately, the film still didn't work for me. Now, I do want to make something clear. If you're one of the people out there who loves the Wicked movie, I'm not here to tell you that you're wrong. This isn't me trying to convince you that it's bad, actually, and you should come around to my opinion, which is the only cool and based one. I just want to tell you why I, as a fan of the source material who really wanted to love the movie, just couldn't get on board with it the way other people seem to have. So, in the interest of being fair, and also maybe convincing the Ariana Grande stans who have no doubt already flooded the comment section to spare my life, I want to kick off the video by talking about some elements of the movie that I genuinely did like. Because there were a few of those. Firstly, there's the music, of course. As I said, I love these songs, and I think they're performed very well here. Which brings me to the next part of the movie I want to praise. The casting. Cynthia Erivo absolutely crushes it as Elphaba. I can't deny that I got goosebumps during her rendition of Defying Gravity, and Jonathan Bailey just oozes charisma out of every pore. I also really appreciate his decision to portray Fiyero as a bisexual king, which I choose to believe without a shred of evidence is a nod to this line from the 1939 film.
Of course, people do go both ways.
I've seen a lot of criticism for Michelle Yeoh's Madame Marble, but honestly, I thought she was fine. It's a very different take on the character than we're used to seeing, but I think portraying her as cold and frigid is just as valid an interpretation as having her basically be Effie from the Hunger Games. Jeff Goldblum is just kind of going through the Jeff Goldblum motions, but it's not as if that doesn't work for the character. But the unquestionable MVP here is Ariana Grande as Glinda. I will admit to having been somewhat skeptical when she was first cast, but she absolutely runs away with the movie. Her voice is great, her comic timing is superb, she somehow manages to do a perfect Kristen Chenoweth impression while still making the role completely her own, and her chemistry with Erivo is very enjoyable. I'm also just so glad that Dr. Dillamond was voiced by Peter Dinklage instead of James Corden. Like, not that Corden was ever seriously said to be in consideration, but it was a big meme for a while that it was probably going to be him, and if that had been the case, I would have been rooting for the evil bigots to take away his power of speech, which is certainly not what I should be feeling when he's on screen. I also really like this little moment between Bok and Nezeros at the beginning, where they wordlessly connect over their inability to see over their classmates' shoulders due to his small stature and her being in a wheelchair. It's a very brief little moment, but I really like it, both because it's cute and endearing and because it actually adds an extra layer of sadness to their dynamic. It creates a sense that there is a genuine connection between them, that they actually could be really good friends, and probably more if not for the fact that Bok is so tragically hung up on this girl who couldn't be less interested in him. Well, that and Nessaros's possessiveness later on in the story, but you get my point. This is a moment that you can really only accomplish on the screen, and it's an effective utilization of what the transition to a different form of media can offer. These are the big things that I really did appreciate about the movie, and ensured that I was at least able to somewhat enjoy myself during the experience. But now the time has come for me to delve into why I just couldn't get on board with Wicked the way many others have. And it really comes down to two major decisions the adaptation makes that left me feeling frustrated. One of these definitely bothered me much more than the other, so let's begin with the one that I have more, let's say, complicated feelings about. On April 26, 2022, director John M. Chu announced that the Wicked movie would be split into two parts. The first movie covering Act 1 leading up to Defying Gravity, and the second covering Act 2. This was around when I first started to get nervous about the movie, and my skepticism about the decision only intensified closer to the first part's release when it was confirmed that it would have a runtime of 2 hours and 40 minutes. To put that in perspective, that's a full 10 minutes longer than the entire Broadway show, including the intermission. Despite Chu's insistence that the choice would give the adaptation more room to breathe, I just couldn't imagine how he could possibly justify stretching the show's 90-minute first act to almost 3 hours. When I finally saw the movie, I can't say that I was any more convinced. I saw it with my girlfriend, who has no familiarity with the Broadway show, and coming out of it, she told me that the pacing reminded her of the Disney live-action remakes, a comparison that I actually think is very apt. Like in those movies, a lot of scenes feel awkwardly padded, extending the runtime but without adding anything substantial to the material, and in some cases disrupting the flow of certain songs. So after seeing the movie, I was prepared to declare that my instinct was correct and the two-part decision was an inherently misguided one that was doomed to fail from the start. But since the film's release, new information has come to light that's made me realize I may have misdiagnosed the problem. So recently, Deadline published the full script for Wicked, including material that was ultimately not included in the final film. And what struck me is that some of these scenes, had they been kept in, may actually have convinced me that splitting the material in two was a smart choice. In particular, I'm referring to a montage right after Popular and before Dr. Dillamond's dismissal, which shows Elphaba, Glinda, Fiyero, Nessarose, and Boq becoming a closer friend group, something that isn't in the show. Not everything about this scene works. There's a bit too much cutesy foreshadowing and a brief reprise of Dancing Through Life that feels a bit lyrically forced. But overall, it actually does feel like it adds something of value to the material. Like, in the show, we admittedly don't get the chance to really see Elphaba and Glinda's friendship develop between Popular and their departure for the Emerald City. So it's nice to have a scene that really shows them becoming closer before they're inevitably torn apart. Similarly, the addition of Boq and Elphaba being friends would have added more of an emotional punch to this line from Act 2's March of the Witch Hunters.
I have a personal score to settle with the witch!
And then there's this other scene included on the film's home video release, which once again really delves into the sisterly bond between Elphaba and Glinda, creating more of a sense of tragedy from the fact that we know their friendship isn't going to last. Given how much Chu has talked about wanting more freedom to expand on the characters' relationships without cutting essential material from the show, I just don't understand the logic behind cutting scenes like this, which do so in a meaningful way, and leaving in some of the runtime expanding decisions that are actually present in the final cut. The exposition dump in the middle of One Short Day, which is only there to shoehorn in cameos from Idina Menzel and Kristen Chenoweth. The detour with the hot air balloon right before defying gravity. The tedious and groan-worthy origin story for the Yellow Brick Road. And perhaps most annoyingly of all, the fact that Defying Gravity itself constantly stops and starts in a way that disrupts the flow of the musical's centerpiece song. A minute and a half of screen time unfolds between the lyrics, "I hope you're happy, my friend," and "So if you care to find me, look to the western sky." Then another minute of screen time unfolds in between the song's penultimate and final lines, just so the film can repeat Madame Marable's speech about Elphaba being a wicked witch, which we literally just heard 5 minutes ago. There are still a couple of genuinely good additions here, particularly how the beginning of Elphaba and Glinda's friendship is given more room to breathe, but otherwise it's largely just clunky filler. I genuinely would have eaten my words about the two-part decision being a bad idea if there had been more of this and less of this. Now, I know what you're thinking, but Rory, how can you possibly judge the effectiveness of the decision before you've seen both parts? And to be honest, touché. I do get that. The second act of Wicked has been criticised for rushing through story beats and tie-ins to The Wizard of Oz, so maybe part 2 is the one that will really benefit from the extended runtime. Maybe it really will give the story more time to breathe. Maybe they'll even have a more active role for Dorothy. And maybe some of the scenes I lamented about being cut from part 1 will be incorporated into part 2 as flashbacks. Chu has actually alluded to this being a possibility. I'm not denying that all of that is possible, but I still think it's fair to judge how the choice affects part 1 in a vacuum. And even if part 2 does a better job of justifying the split, I don't think it would change the fact that its predecessor feels fatally bloated and doesn't utilize the expanded runtime to its full potential. But all this being said, even with all my serious issues about how the movie goes out achieving this expanded runtime, I could envision a world where this didn't bother me quite as much. If that was my only major issue with the film, I could honestly see myself giving it a solid 6 out of 10, maybe 7 if I was in a really good mood. But alas, there's another big problem I have with Wicked, one that is frankly much more detrimental to the viewing experience. And unfortunately, it's really not one that I expect part 2 to rectify. Yes, Wicked's big problem is that it just looks ugly. It's not pleasant to look at, and this is unfortunately a pretty big problem in what is a visual medium. I'm far from the first person to observe this. Since the release of the first trailer, there's been a lot of talk online about the film's desaturated MCU-reminiscent color grading and its truly hideous overexposed backlighting. But there's a good reason for that. It looks bad. And this becomes an even bigger problem when so much of your movie's iconography is taken from one of the most gorgeous and iconic works of the Technicolor era, inviting comparisons that don't do you any favors. When asked about the way the film looks, Chu responded that the intention was to make Oz feel like a real place, arguing that if it was a dream in someone's mind, then the real relationships and the stakes that these two girls are going through wouldn't feel real. Now, I obviously believe that a director has every right to defend their creative decisions, but I'm sorry, I just think this is a really misguided way of approaching the material. First of all, while I don't think this was Chu's intention at all, it comes off as strangely dismissive of the 1939 Wizard of Oz. Yes, the events of that movie are portrayed as a dream, but we still get invested in Dorothy's relationships with her companions and feel genuinely sad when she bids them farewell. But even beyond that, we're talking about a musical here. This is a genre in which characters regularly burst into spontaneous song and dance numbers. It invites non-naturalism. The Umbrellas of Cherbourg is a heartbreaking romantic drama about young lovers torn apart by circumstance, and it's one of the most vibrantly colourful movies ever made. Yes, this does lend it a dreamlike quality, but that doesn't come at the expense of emotional impact. So no, I don't think that a more non-naturalistic approach would have made the audience less likely to invest in Elphaba and Glinda's relationship. The film even opts for a title card that very deliberately evokes Golden Age Hollywood musicals, so why not fully commit to that? Obviously you're not going to make something that actually looks like Technicolor in the modern world, but Oz should be a place where the colours pop off the screen. It's a huge part of what made audiences fall in love with the 1939 film. Writer Brendan Hodges summed it up best on Twitter, saying that Chu's quote exemplifies this recent trend of directors viewing the inherent artifice of cinema as something to be hidden rather than embraced, and I don't like that. What makes this even worse is that the other craft elements of this movie are actually really good. The costumes and production design are gorgeous, and it's kind of a problem that the set photos do them more justice than the actual finished product. The lighting in this movie is genuinely atrocious. Like, to a baffling degree. Every time there's any bright light in the frame, it actively hurts my eyes. Nowhere is this more apparent than during Dancing Through Life, which should be one of the standout numbers of the film, and in a lot of ways, it is. There's a great Jonathan Bailey performance at the center, the choreography is solid, and the set design is really clever and inventive, particularly the rotating library. It's just too bad that it looks flat as fuck, and every time the characters step in front of an open window, I can barely make out what's going on. Another example is The Wizard and I. Once again, Cynthia Erivo's rendition of the song is lovely, but she's singing it in the middle of this bland, grey, MCU-looking field surrounded by a beige desert. Her performance, as opposed to the actual filmmaking, is doing 100% of the heavy lifting in terms of getting an emotional response out of me. Compare this to Steven Spielberg's West Side Story, which is probably the best Broadway-to-film musical adaptation of the last 10 years, so obviously nobody saw it. The camera work in this movie is dynamic and kinetic, and Spielberg wisely doesn't rely too heavily on constant cuts during his big ensemble numbers so you can actually appreciate the choreography and blocking. To me, the key difference between these two movies is that I often find myself revisiting actual clips of the musical numbers from West Side Story to marvel at the cinematic artistry on display, in addition to enjoying the actual singing. Whereas in the case of Wicked, I'm good to just fire up Ariana Grande's Popular or Jonathan Bailey's Dancing Through Life on Spotify, never really feeling compelled to seek out the actual scenes themselves. Obviously not every director can be Steven Spielberg, but I just think more modern filmmakers could take a page out of his book when it comes to directing a movie musical these days. Also, he and cinematographer Janusz Kaminski managed to create a gritty aesthetic in a way that still looks vibrant, cinematic, and colourful, so it can in fact be done. It doesn't have to look like this. Look, it's clear at this point that a lot of people love the Wicked movie, and I'm genuinely happy for them. I'm also aware that a lot of them won't make it this far into the video and have probably already left several comments telling me to die, but that's just the nature of being an online creator. But if you have made it this far, just know that I'm not saying these things to be nitpicky or to just tear apart the thing that's popular, haha, for the sake of it. You don't have to agree with everything, or indeed anything I've said here, but I keep seeing criticisms similar to my own dismissed online as being pretentious, which I just think is a very troubling way of responding to people who genuinely care about the craft of filmmaking. If none of the things that bothered me bother you, then more power to you. But as someone who loves film, and indeed as someone who loves Wicked the musical, I don't think it's unreasonable to expect more from an adaptation than just good casting and enjoyable covers of songs that I love. I'll still see the second installment, but this first part left me feeling sadly underwhelmed.